The morning sky over the East China Sea should have been empty. Commander Kosaku Aruga stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, scanning the horizon with binoculars that had cost more than most Japanese families earned in a year. It was April 7th, 1945, and the largest battleship ever constructed was steaming north toward Okinawa on what everyone aboard knew was a one-way mission. They had fuel for the journey there, but none for the return. That part didn't bother Aruga as much as what he saw at 10 o'clock that morning, a single American aircraft, impossibly high, tracking them like a patient predator. The spotter plane's appearance meant the end of surprise, the end of hope, and the beginning of a demonstration that would shatter 2 decades of Japanese naval philosophy in approximately 2 hours. Below decks, 19-year-old Petty Officer Mitsuru Yoshida felt the ship's massive engines thrumming through the steel plating. He'd grown up hearing stories about battleship superiority, about how these floating fortresses represented the ultimate expression of naval power. His father had served in the Russo-Japanese War back in 1905, when Japanese battleships had destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet at Tsushima. That victory had taught Japan a lesson it never forgot, or rather, a lesson it remembered too well. Big guns and heavy armor won wars at sea. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Yoshida had joined the Imperial Japanese Navy, believing he'd serve on the most powerful warship ever built. The recruiting posters showed the Yamato's massive turrets. Each gun barrel wider than a man was tall. They showed armor plating thick enough to stop any shell ever made. They didn't show American torpedo bombers. The Yamato represented more than just a ship. She embodied a strategic philosophy that dated back to the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, when the great powers had agreed to limit their naval construction. Japan had chafed under those restrictions, feeling cheated of its rightful place among the world's navies. When the treaty system collapsed in the mid-1930s, Japanese naval architects saw their chance to build something unprecedented, a battleship so large, so powerful, so heavily armored that it would be functionally invincible. Construction began in secret at the Kure Naval Arsenal in November of 1937. The project was so classified that workers were required to sign documents swearing they would never discuss what they built. Guard towers ringed the construction site. Canvas screens blocked the view from the water. Even aerial photography was forbidden in the area. Japan was building a weapon it believed would decide the Pacific War before it even started. The specifications seemed impossible even to the men building her. The main guns were 18.1 inches in diameter, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. Each shell weighed more than a small automobile, roughly 3,200 pounds. When all 9 main guns fired together, the blast wave could kill a man standing too close on deck. The armor belt protecting the ship's vitals measured 16 inches thick in places, forged from a special steel alloy that Japanese metallurgists had spent years perfecting. She displaced 72,000 tons fully loaded, making her heavier than any battleship the Americans or British possessed. Her main armor deck was 9 inches of steel designed to detonate armor-piercing bombs before they could penetrate to the magazines below. Her designers had studied every battleship engagement in modern history and concluded they had created something that could survive anything an enemy might throw at it, as long as that enemy fought by the rules of battleship warfare. The Yamato's commissioning in December of 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor, should have marked the beginning of her legend. Instead, it marked the beginning of a long, frustrating obsolescence that no one in the Imperial Japanese Navy wanted to acknowledge. The problem wasn't the ship. The problem was that naval warfare had fundamentally changed, and Japan's most powerful weapon was built for a war that no longer existed. While Japan poured resources into building the Yamato and her sister ship Musashi, the United States Navy was learning hard lessons about aircraft carriers in the Pacific. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 became the first naval engagement in history where the opposing ships never saw each other. Aircraft did all the fighting. A month later, at Midway, American dive bombers sank 4 Japanese carriers in a single day. The age of the battleship was ending, but Japan's naval leadership couldn't let go of the doctrine that had defined their service for 40 years. Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida had studied these battles at the Naval Academy, but his instructors always framed them as aberrations, temporary setbacks in a larger strategy where battleships would still prove decisive. The Yamato had been held in reserve, they explained, waiting for the climactic surface engagement where her massive guns would smash any American battle line. That engagement never came. Instead, the Yamato spent most of the war anchored at various bases, earning the bitter nickname Hotel Yamato from Japanese sailors assigned to more active vessels. By early 1945, Japan's strategic situation had deteriorated beyond any possibility of conventional victory. American forces were preparing to invade Okinawa, the last major island, before the Japanese home islands themselves. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the third largest in the world, had been reduced to a fraction of its former strength. Most of its carriers were sunk. Most of its trained pilots were dead. Fuel oil was so scarce that ships remained in port for months at a time. In this context, the Japanese High Command conceived Operation Tengo, roughly translated as Operation Heaven No. 1. The plan was simple in its desperation. The Yamato, accompanied by a light cruiser and 8 destroyers, would steam directly to Okinawa and beach herself on the island's coast. Her massive guns would then serve as stationary artillery, firing at American positions until her ammunition ran out or she was destroyed. The crew would then abandon ship and fight as infantry. It was a suicide mission disguised as a tactical operation, and everyone involved knew it. The task force would have just enough fuel oil for a one-way trip. No air cover would be provided. Japan simply didn't have enough operational aircraft to spare. The sailors would steam north into waters completely controlled by American naval and air forces, hoping to get close enough to Okinawa to make their deaths meaningful. On the afternoon of April 6, 1945, the Yamato and her escorts departed from Tokuyama in the inland sea. The sailors knew where they were going. Many wrote final letters to their families before departure, letters that would be delivered only if the writers didn't return, which meant the letters would certainly be delivered. There were no illusions aboard the Yamato that morning. This was a kamikaze mission for a ship that had been designed to rule the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Tamechi Hara, commanding one of the escort destroyers, later recalled the atmosphere as the task force formed up. We were sailing to our deaths, and we knew it. But there was also a strange sense of relief. For years, the Yamato had been held back, preserved, kept safe, while smaller ships and braver men died in her place. Now, finally, she would fight. It was foolish and wasteful, but it felt more honourable than letting her rust in port while Japan burned. The task force made reasonable progress through the night, maintaining radio silence and hoping that darkness would shield them from American reconnaissance. That hope died at dawn on April 7th, when multiple American patrol aircraft spotted the formation. The sighting reports went immediately to Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, the most powerful concentration of naval aviation ever assembled. Mitcher commanded 7 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers, together embarking more than 400 combat aircraft. His ships were positioned between the Yamato and Okinawa, perfectly placed to intercept. When he received confirmation of the Japanese task force's composition and heading, Mitcher didn't hesitate. He ordered a maximum effort strike. Every available bomber and torpedo plane would launch immediately. The battleship admirals might mourn the death of their doctrine, but carrier admirals like Mitcher had learned a brutal efficiency in the Pacific. You didn't sink an enemy warship with 1 or 2 careful strikes. You overwhelmed it with so many attacking aircraft that its defences became mathematically irrelevant. Aboard the Yamato, Commander Aruga received the first definite sighting report at approximately 1000 hours. The American spotter plane had radioed their position, course, and speed. Within the hour, they could expect the first wave of attackers. Aruga ordered the crew to battle stations and increased speed to 24 knots fast for a battleship of her size, but painfully slow compared to the aircraft that would soon arrive. Petty Officer Yoshida took his position in one of the ship's many anti-aircraft gun mounts. The Yamato carried more than 150 anti-aircraft guns of various calibers, from 25mm machine cannons to larger 5-inch dual-purpose guns. Japanese naval designers had added these weapons throughout the war, as it became clear that air attack was the primary threat. But there was the fundamental problem with defending a ship the size of the Yamato against modern air attack. The ship was so large, so massive, that it couldn't maneuver quickly. What made her invulnerable to battleship shells made her an ideal target for aircraft. The morning remained clear, with excellent visibility, perfect weather for dive bombers and torpedo planes, terrible weather for the men trying to shoot them down. As noon approached, lookouts on the Yamato spotted the first wave of American aircraft on the horizon, appearing initially as small, dark specks that gradually resolved into formations of dozens of planes. Then more formations appeared behind them, and more behind those. Yoshida watched them come with a feeling he would later describe as similar to watching a tsunami approaching from far at sea, the certainty that something massive and unstoppable was rolling toward you, and there was nowhere to run. The Americans had sent nearly 400 aircraft in multiple waves, more planes than Yoshida had ever seen in one place. The first wave began its attack at 12:32 in the afternoon. American doctrine for attacking capital ships had been refined through years of Pacific combat into a brutal choreography. Torpedo bombers would attack from both sides simultaneously, forcing the target ship to choose which threat to turn toward. While the ship maneuvered to avoid torpedoes, dive bombers would attack from above, targeting the flight decks of carriers or the superstructure of battleships. The attacking aircraft would come in waves, never giving the defenders time to recover or regroup. Commander Frederick Schrader led the first group of bombers from the carrier USS Bennington. He'd been briefed that morning on the Yamato's specifications, the armor thickness, the gun placement, the theoretical invulnerability to anything but sustained, concentrated attack. The briefing officer had shown reconnaissance photos of the ship and told them simply, "She's big, she's tough, and you're going to need to hit her with everything we've got." From Schrader's cockpit, the Yamato looked impossibly large, a steel island steaming across the East China Sea. Her anti-aircraft guns had already opened fire, filling the sky with black bursts of flak and tracers. The Japanese gunners were well trained, and the volume of fire was impressive, but there were simply too many American aircraft attacking from too many directions. Some planes would be shot down, that was inevitable, but enough would get through to deliver their weapons. The torpedo bombers came in low and fast, some of them skimming just 50 feet above the water to stay below the worst of the anti-aircraft fire. Ensign Yoshida, firing his 25mm gun mount, watched one American Avenger take hits and start smoking but continue its run anyway, releasing its torpedo before cartwheeling into the sea. The weapon ran true, striking the Yamato on her port side with a tremendous explosion that sent a column of water higher than the ship's superstructure. Then another torpedo hit. And another. The torpedoes were Mark 13 models, carrying 600 pounds of high explosive in their warheads. The Yamato's armor belt could stop battleship shells, but torpedoes exploded below the waterline, where the armor was thinner and the hydrostatic shock could do catastrophic damage to the ship's internal structure. Each hit opened the hull to the sea, and the Yamato began taking on water. Commander Aruga ordered damage control parties to counter flood compartments on the opposite side of the ship to maintain balance, a standard procedure for torpedo damage. But the attacks kept coming in waves, and each wave included more torpedoes striking from different angles. The counter-flooding couldn't keep pace. The Yamato began developing a list to port a tilt that grew gradually more severe as thousands of tons of seawater poured into her ruptured hull. While torpedo bombers attacked from the sides, dive bombers screamed down from above. The Curtiss SB-2C Helldivers carried 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs designed specifically to penetrate heavy deck armor. The pilots aimed for the Yamato's superstructure and deck, trying to knock out gun positions and start fires. Several bombs struck home, tearing through the ship's upper works and detonating inside. Fires broke out in multiple locations. Smoke began pouring from wounds in the great ship's structure. Petty Officer Yoshida later recalled that the overwhelming sensation during the attack was noise, the constant thunder of the ship's own anti-aircraft guns, the screaming of diving aircraft, the explosions of bombs and torpedoes, and underneath it all, a deep groaning from the ship's structure as it absorbed damage that would have sunk any normal vessel 10 times over. Men shouted orders that couldn't be heard. Damage reports came in faster than anyone could process them. The Yamato was being hit faster than her crew could even count the impacts. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, less than 30 minutes into the attack, the Yamato had absorbed at least 5 torpedo hits and multiple bomb strikes. The list to port had increased to 15 degrees, making it difficult to walk on deck and impossible to aim many of her guns effectively. Water had flooded dozens of compartments, drowning men trapped below decks who couldn't escape through twisted hatches. The ship was still fighting, still firing her anti-aircraft guns, but she was clearly dying. The second wave of American aircraft arrived at 1:20, while the first wave was still departing, and the Yamato's gunners were exhausted from the initial onslaught. These aircraft attacked with the same coordinated precision, torpedo bombers low, dive bombers high, all converging on a target that could no longer maneuver effectively. The list to port made it impossible for the Yamato to turn into the torpedo attacks, rendering one of a battleship's primary defensive tactics useless. More torpedoes struck the port side, each one driving the ship closer to capsizing. The Yamato's designers had built in tremendous reserve buoyancy and compartmentalization, but they had never anticipated this volume of damage delivered this quickly. Modern naval warfare had become a question of mathematics. How many tons of explosives could aircraft deliver versus how much damage a ship could absorb? Against 400 attacking aircraft, even the Yamato's massive size and heavy armor couldn't shift the equation enough. Commander Aruga knew his ship was doomed but continued directing the defense, trying to shoot down as many attackers as possible before the end. Japanese naval tradition held that a captain should go down with his ship, and Aruga had no intention of abandoning the Yamato. Below decks, damage control parties worked frantically to shore up bulkheads and pump water, knowing their efforts were futile but driven by training and pride to try anyway. Lieutenant Naoyoshi Ishida, the ship's senior damage control officer, compiled reports from throughout the vessel as the situation deteriorated. The forward engine room was flooded, the steering gear was damaged, fires burned out of control in multiple sections. Most critically, the progressive flooding on the port side had reached a point where capsizing was now inevitable rather than merely possible. The laws of physics and naval architecture were asserting themselves. The Yamato was too top-heavy with water in her port side, and there simply weren't enough intact compartments remaining to counter flood. At 1:30 in the afternoon, a massive explosion shook the ship from a torpedo hit near the engineering spaces. The lights went out throughout most of the vessel. Emergency lighting kicked in, but whole sections remained in darkness. Yoshida felt the deck angle more steeply beneath his feet. The list had reached 20 degrees, then 25. Men began sliding across the deck. Loose equipment crashed into bulkheads. The ship was rolling over, and nothing could stop it. Commander Aruga gave the order to abandon ship at approximately 1:45. The command was almost unnecessary. Sailors were already jumping into the water to escape the rolling vessel. Some damage control parties, trapped below decks by jammed hatches and twisted passages, never received the order. They would drown in darkness as the ship rolled over, their last moments spent in cramped steel compartments, rapidly filling with cold seawater. Petty Officer Yoshida climbed up the tilting deck toward the high side of the ship, fighting against the angle that was rapidly approaching 45 degrees. He could see other sailors struggling to do the same, and others who had already given up and jumped into the oil-slicked water below. American aircraft continued circling overhead, but most had stopped attacking. The Yamato was clearly finished, and pilots didn't waste ordnance on a dying ship. The Yamato rolled completely over at 2:05 in the afternoon, her massive hull turning turtle and exposing the red anti-fouling paint on her bottom. For a few moments she floated upside down, a surreal image of one of history's greatest warships, reduced to a capsized wreck. Then her magazines exploded in a catastrophic detonation that sent a mushroom cloud of smoke and debris 6,000 feet into the air, high enough to be seen from Kagoshima, over 100 miles away. The explosion killed most of the men still aboard, and many of those in the water nearby. Yoshida, who had swum far enough away to survive the blast, felt the shock wave through the water like being punched by an invisible fist. When he surfaced and looked back toward where the Yamato had been, he saw only a spreading circle of debris, oil, and smoke. The largest battleship ever built had disappeared in approximately 2 hours of sustained air attack. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The escort ships tried to rescue survivors, but they were also under attack and couldn't linger long in the area. Of the Yamato's crew of roughly 2,670 men, only 276 survived. Commander Aruga went down with his ship, as did most of the senior officers. The light cruiser Yahagi and 3 of the destroyers were also sunk during the battle. The remaining destroyers, damaged and low on fuel, retreated to Japan with the survivors they had managed to pull from the water. Yoshida spent nearly 5 hours in the water before being picked up by the destroyer Fuyuzuki. He was coated in fuel oil, exhausted, and suffering from exposure, but alive. As the destroyer steamed slowly back toward Japan, he had time to contemplate what had just happened. The ship he'd believed was Invincible, the weapon that was supposed to demonstrate Japanese naval superiority, had been destroyed without ever firing its main guns at an enemy surface vessel. The massive 18.1-inch rifles, the heaviest armor ever mounted on a warship, the decades of design, work and construction, all of it had proven irrelevant against aircraft that cost a fraction of what the Yamato had cost and could be built in months rather than years. The Americans lost 10 aircraft and 12 crew members in the attack on the Yamato task force. It was an absurdly lopsided exchange, Japan's most powerful warship and thousands of trained sailors in exchange for a dozen aircraft that would be replaced within days. The battle perfectly illustrated the fundamental shift in naval warfare that Japan's leadership had refused to accept. Battleships, no matter how large or well-armored, could not survive against massed air attack. The weapon that was supposed to dominate the Pacific had instead become a symbol of strategic obsolescence. News of the Yamato's sinking was initially suppressed by Japanese authorities, but rumors spread quickly through the military and civilian population. For many Japanese, the loss represented more than just a ship. It symbolized the collapse of the beliefs and doctrines that had guided Japan's military for decades. The battleship, the ultimate expression of industrial power and naval might, had been rendered obsolete by a weapon that Japan had pioneered at Pearl Harbor but failed to fully embrace. The irony was particularly bitter for the survivors. Yoshida and the other sailors who lived through the Yamato's final voyage spent the remaining months of the war trying to reconcile what they'd been taught with what they'd experienced. They'd been told the Yamato was invincible, that Japanese engineering and fighting spirit could overcome any challenge. Instead, they'd watched helplessly as American aircraft swarmed their ship like insects, delivering more firepower in 2 hours than most battleships would face in an entire war. In his post-war memoir, Yoshida reflected on the moment when he realized the Yamato would sink. I had spent my entire naval career believing in the supremacy of the battleship, in the idea that the ship with the biggest guns and thickest armor would always win. It took less than 2 hours for the Americans to prove that everything I believed was wrong. They didn't need bigger battleships. They didn't need to fight us on our terms. They simply sent enough aircraft to make our armor irrelevant and our guns useless. We were fighting with the tactics of 1905 in a war that demanded the thinking of 1945. The American pilots and planners saw the battle differently. For them, the Yamato represented not a worthy opponent, but an anachronism, a threat that could be neutralized with established doctrine and overwhelming force. Captain Arleigh Burke, who would later become Chief of Naval Operations, summarized the American perspective. The Japanese built the Yamato to fight the previous war. We built carriers to fight the war we were actually in. The outcome was never in doubt once we located her. The loss of the Yamato had virtually no impact on the course of the war. By April of 1945, Japan had already lost. The home islands were being firebombed nightly. The navy was reduced to scattered remnants. The army was preparing for a final, desperate defense against invasion. Whether the Yamato survived or sank changed nothing about Japan's strategic situation, but symbolically, the loss resonated deeply. The ship that was supposed to ensure Japanese naval dominance had instead demonstrated how completely Japan had misread the nature of modern warfare. Some historians argue that the Yamato's construction represented a catastrophic misallocation of resources. The steel, labor, and industrial capacity required to build her could have produced dozens of smaller warships, hundreds of aircraft, or thousands of other weapons systems that might have made a real difference in the Pacific War. But Japanese naval leadership, trapped by institutional culture and historical precedent, couldn't let go of the battleship doctrine that had served them so well in 1905. The actual construction cost of the Yamato remains somewhat unclear due to the secrecy surrounding the project, but estimates suggest she consumed approximately 140 million yen in 1941 currency, roughly 300 million in contemporary American dollars. That figure doesn't include the ongoing costs of crew, fuel, ammunition, and maintenance. For a ship that spent most of her operational life at anchor and sank on her first and only offensive mission, the return on investment was catastrophically poor. Perhaps more importantly, the Yamato absorbed resources and strategic thinking that might have been directed toward developing the kind of naval aviation capability that actually determined the outcome of the Pacific War. While Japan was perfecting 18-inch guns, the United States was perfecting aircraft carriers, naval aviation tactics, and the industrial capacity to produce both planes and ships faster than Japan could sink them. By the time the Yamato sailed on Operation 10 Go, the United States was building Essex-class carriers so quickly that one was being commissioned roughly every 6 weeks. The survivors of the Yamato spent the rest of their lives carrying the memory of those 2 hours in April of 1945. Many struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they had lived when so many others died. Yoshida became one of the most prominent survivors, writing extensively about his experience and becoming something of a spokesperson for the tragedy. He emphasized in his writings that the men who died aboard the Yamato were not fools or fanatics, they were sailors following orders, doing their duty as they understood it, trapped by strategic decisions made long before they ever set foot on the ship. The wreck of the Yamato was located in 1985 by a Japanese survey team. She lies in roughly 1,100 feet of water, broken into several major sections. The bow section sits upright, relatively intact, her massive anchor chains still visible. The stern section, containing the remains of the explosion that finally killed her, is heavily damaged and scattered across the seabed. Japanese maritime regulations prohibit salvage or disturbance of the wreck, which is considered a war grave containing the remains of over 2,000 men. In the decades since the war, the Yamato has become a symbol of both Japanese technological achievement and strategic failure. Museums in Japan display artifacts from the ship alongside detailed explanations of her construction and capabilities. But they also, increasingly, acknowledge the fundamental error in judgment that she represented the mistake of building a weapon for the wrong kind of war, of letting tradition and institutional pride override strategic reality. The story of the Yamato is ultimately a story about the danger of fighting the last war instead of the current one. Japan's naval leadership looked at their victory at Tsushima in 1905 and concluded that battleships were the key to naval supremacy. They built the Yamato to be the ultimate battleship, the weapon that could never be defeated in surface combat. They were right, she probably couldn't have been defeated in surface combat. But the Americans never tried to fight her that way. They used aircraft, and the Yamato's invincibility evaporated in less time than it takes to watch a feature film. For the men who died aboard her, the Yamato's technological excellence and impressive specifications offered no comfort in their final moments. They drowned or burned or were blown apart by explosions. Their deaths made no less real by the thickness of the armor or the size of the guns. And for the survivors like Yoshida, The memory of watching the greatest battleship ever built roll over and explode became a permanent reminder of how completely wrong a nation's strategic assumptions could be. The American pilots who sank the Yamato went on to other missions, other targets. For them, she was just another enemy warship to be destroyed, distinguished mainly by her size. They landed back on their carriers, submitted their action reports, and prepared for the next operation. The battle that shattered decades of Japanese naval doctrine was, for the Americans, a Tuesday afternoon's work impressive in its execution, but not particularly remarkable in a war that had already seen countless demonstrations of air power's supremacy over surface ships. In the end, the Yamato's story is less about technology than about psychology, the psychological investment in a particular way of war, the inability to adapt when that way becomes obsolete, and the terrible cost of learning hard lessons too late. Japan learned at Tsushima that battleships could win wars. They spent 40 years perfecting that lesson, building ships like the Yamato to embody their doctrine. Then, in 2 hours on a clear April afternoon, they learned that the world had changed, that their perfect weapon was useless against an enemy who refused to fight on their terms. Petty Officer Yoshida lived until 2009, dying at the age of 83. In his final interviews, he still spoke about those 2 hours in April of 1945, about watching the Yamato die and understanding, perhaps for the first time, that bravery and tradition and technical excellence couldn't overcome fundamental strategic error. "We built the finest battleship that ever sailed," he said, "and sent her to fight in a war where battleships no longer mattered. That's not a tragedy. That's just stupidity, wrapped in steel and painted grey." The 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs that sank the Yamato, the final count was never entirely certain, but those were the figures most commonly cited by both Japanese survivors and American after-action reports, cost a fraction of what the ship cost to build. The aircraft that delivered them were obsolete by modern standards, piston-engine planes that would be retired within a few years of the war's end. But they were the right weapon for the war being fought, and that made all the difference. The battleship era ended officially on various dates, depending on how one counts the last battleship versus battleship engagement, the last time a battleship fired its main guns in anger, the retirement of the last battleship from active service. But symbolically, it ended at 2:05 in the afternoon on April 7, 1945, when the Yamato rolled over and exploded, taking with her the doctrine that had shaped naval warfare for half a century. Everything that came after was just formality. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.